Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. If you are an occasional visitor here, my name is Jody, I love watches and I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel by hitting the big button with the word subscribe on it. Today it's a head-to-head, a fairly ambitious video. I've only made one similar video in the past. It's the SKX versus its rivals, really more its heirs apparent. The SKX, for better or for worse, was the default choice if you wanted an everyday $200 dive style watch. Seiko, in their infinite wisdom, discontinued the SKX towards the middle of last year. And it was 20 odd years old, it was high time they refreshed it. But the watch that they replaced it with a couple of months later, the SRPD, wasn't quite what people had in mind. So today I thought I would gather the SKX. You can still buy them, by the way, but they are more expensive. I'll talk about that later. And put it head to head with three of what I see as its closest rivals. Those being the SRPD, I've got the 57 model, the so-called 5KX, the Orient Kamasu, a watch from the same stable that's owned by the same parent company that owns Seiko, and the Sharkey HEIMDALLR SKX clone. Now there is an argument that the Long Island Watches Islander should be here, but it's $300 for the same specs as the Sharkey. If you're going to spend $300, that's an entirely separate video. I wanted to keep it to that $200 price point that the SKX was so dominant at. So what's my angle today? Where am I looking at these watches from? Well, I'm looking at them from the perspective that you want an everyday dive watch. This is going to be your daily driver. This is going to be the watch that you wear more often than not, and I've judged them all on that basis. Let's flip the camera and get on with the judging. Okay, so SKX versus SRPD versus Orient Kamasu versus Sharkey. That's the order that I'm going to talk about them in. That's the order they are on the table. I paid for these two. The Orient was sent to me by JOMASHOP for review, and the SKX belongs to a good friend and physiotherapist of mine, Phew. There he is. Since I started seeing Phew back in August last year, he spent $3 on watches, so I'm clearly a bad influence. Thanks for the loan of your SKX, mate. Alright, I'm going to start by talking about some of the things that I'm not going to talk about, if you see what I mean. I'm not going to talk about the packaging because who cares. I'm not going to talk about the warranty because that obviously will vary depending on where you buy this watch from. From 1 year if you buy grey market, to 2 years if you buy from HEIMDALLR, 3 years if you buy the Seiko from an AD. So again, take that into consideration. How important is that to you? Bear that in mind when you're purchasing. One last thing that I'm not going to talk about is water resistance rating. One problem that people have with the SRPD is that it's only got 100 meters and a push-pull crown, as opposed to the old SKX, which has a screw-down crown, proper ISO rated divers 200 meters. These two, by the way, screw-down crown and 200 meters. I'm going to argue that these are daily drivers. You're not really going to be wearing this one diving hardcore. If you are, then don't pick the SRPD. You're probably going to be wearing something different. Ideally a diving computer on your wrist anyway. So if water resistance is super important to you, then bear that in mind as a factor. I'm going to set it to one side today. But I'm obviously going to talk about the price, so let's start with that. SKX, you can still buy them. I reckon there's going to be stock for maybe the next year, maybe till the end of 2020. Certainly if the Seiko Sarbo 3.3 is anything to go by, there was about 18 months worth of residual stock in the pipeline. $250 US on eBay at the moment. I don't think that's a bad price at all, given these were hovering around the 200s before they were discontinued. I'll leave links to all of these in the description of the video. SRPD, you can buy these all day long from various sources for around 220. Similarly with the Kamasu, 220. I got mine from JOMASHOP, 210. The Sharkey though is the cheapest watch on the table today by a margin. 150 on a 3-link Oyster, 159 on the Jubilee, the 5-link Jubilee that I opted for. So $100 between the cheapest watch and the most expensive watch. I'm going to factor that back in at the bottom, value for money. So 10 different categories, each with a maximum score of 10. However, I'm going to double weight 4 of them. As I said, I'm going to treat this comparison as if you were looking for your next daily driver, and I'm going to overweight the factors that I think would be important in an everyday watch, such as comfort, brand identity, etc. Let's start with movement though, as I always do. The SKX gets a 6 double weighted to 12, the SRPD gets a 9 double weighted to 18, as does the Orient. The Sharkey gets an 8 double weighted to 16. The movement in the Seiko SKX is the Seiko 7S26. It debuted at the same time as the watch did, i.e. 1996, so it's as old as the hills. Bit basic as a consequence, it doesn't hack, it doesn't hand wind, so you'll be doing the old Seiko shuffle if you run out of charge with this one. Not such a massive issue on a daily, and it does have a day-date complication, which is a boon if you are going to be using this one as your Monday to Friday watch as well as your weekend watch. Still, it's pretty basic, it only gets a 6 doubled up to 12. The SRPD has the movement in it that everybody wished they would update the SKX with, that being the 4R36, the NH36, hacking and hand winding 24 dual auto, roughly 40-hour power reserve and a day-date complication on the dial. Proven, reliable, rugged also, arguably all you really need in a daily driver. Great movement choice, 9 out of 10. The one in the Orient is a new or relatively new movement. It debuted a couple of years ago. It's the F6922. Orient in-house this time, hacking and hand winding, roughly 40-hour power reserve, and the bonus of a day-date complication on the dial as well. Stated tolerances are slightly sharper than the Seiko, but it doesn't have the proven track record. It still gets a 9 though, double weighted to 18. The Sharkey has the Seiko NH35 movement. Now that is the date-only version of the NH36 featured in the SRPD, so it's a better movement than features in the Seiko SKX for $100 less. Again, great choice. It only drops a point because it doesn't have the day of the week as well as the date of the month. Next category, case, and by that I mean the fit, the finish and the features on the head of the watch. SKX gets a strong 8, the SRPD is almost identical, so it also gets an 8. Orient drops 1 point with a 7. The Sharkey, in spite of the similarities, drops 2 points to a 6. The standard of finishing on the SKX is perfectly decent for a $200 watch. Nice smooth curves to the side of the midcase here, high polish. We've got a little bit of brush on the lug, no fancy chamfered edges or transitions. A couple of crown guards which maybe do too good a job of protecting that unsigned crown. Case back has got the kind of Seiko wave, the kind of classic Seiko diver's wave here. Everything super smooth, high polished case back, no sharp edges anywhere, a very comfortable watch as I'll discuss later on, 8 out of 10. The SRPD, very similar look and feel to the SKX, very similar design overall, same mixture of brushed and polished, very similar look and feel to the crown and crown guards. Maybe the case back protrudes slightly more because it is a display case back, hard legs on the back of that one as well, but it does have drilled lugs. Overall though, same but different, 8 out of 10. Nothing wrong with the fit and finish of the Orient case per se, 7 out of 10 is still a pretty strong score. High polished side, bit of brushing on the upper lugs, similar design on the case back, but it all just seems a bit plain, a little bit basic, hence the 7. The case finishing on the Sharkey looks almost identical to the SKX and the SRPD. Similar profile, similar polished curves, similar brush on the lugs. It drops a couple of points though because of those crown guards. They are sharp on the bottom edge. Not all that pleasant to use, makes the crown a little bit uncomfortable in operation. Bit of a disappointment there for the Sharkey. It could have got an 8, but it only gets a 6. Next up, crystal. 5 out of 10 for the SKX, 5 out of 10 for the SRPD, a strong 8 for the Orient, top of the class 9 for the Sharkey. These two watches feature hard legs, so we got the movement upgrade that we wanted, but we didn't get the upgrade to sapphire. There is an argument for a mineral crystal on a dive watch. It'll scratch and not shatter, but that argument rather falls by the wayside if it's a daily driver. You don't want it to scratch if you're going to be wearing this one every day. Hard legs has its fans. I'm not one of them. 5 out of 10. One of the big advantages therefore of the Orient or the Sharkey, in my opinion anyway, is the sapphire crystal. Dead flat sapphire crystal with no anti-reflective coating on the Orient gets an 8. Flat sapphire crystal with anti-reflective coating on the Sharkey gets a very strong 9. Next up, bezel and insert. These are all dive style watches. All of them feature 120 click unidirectional rotating dive time bezels. My scores are therefore based on the quality of the insert and the overall feel of the bezel action. Basic aluminium insert in the SKX, but with a Lume pip up there in the triangle at 12. Familiar action if you're used to Seikos. Not all that noisy, kind of nice and comfortable. A little bit of backplay and bounce, but nothing too bad. Solid 7 out of 10. SRPD gets a 6, so it drops a point. Really, that's for the lack of Lume pit there at 12. I know, as discussed, it's not a proper dive watch, but it would have been nice. Action, very, very similar. This one is box fresh, so it's a bit stiffer than the SKX, but pretty solid feeling, 6 out of 10. 7 for the Kamasu, again, another matte insert here. A little bit lighter, a little bit easier than the SRPD was, perhaps. Similar feeling overall, no backplay, no bounce, solid 7. The Sharkey gains an extra point by featuring the only ceramic insert of the day. It then loses that point straight away by featuring a nasty, sticky outy Lume pip on the triangle at 12. Not quite sure why they did that. Action markedly different from the others. A little bit noisier, but it still inspires confidence. Pretty solid 7 out of 10. Category number 5, halfway there, dial and hands. SRPD takes its first category victory with a 9 out of 10. Strong showings by the SKX and the Sharkey with 8 out of 10. Orient losing one more point with a 7. Now, I have described the Seiko SKX before as having a face only a mother could love. Perhaps that was a little harsh, but it is certainly function over form here. Very much legible, but not all that pretty. Just a plain printed dial, printed Seiko automatic, printed divers. 200 meters and 21 joules there, printed indices all the way around, the distinctive triangle, double baton and circles everywhere else. No need for a fancy frame around the day-date complication at 3 o'clock either. Handset is very basic but classic signature Seiko stuff. One controversial point is the counterbalance, the Lume counterbalance on that second hand. It means that if you are looking at this one after dark, you're effectively reading it 30 seconds behind the actual time. Not all that pretty, but certainly at a glance legible, which is an advantage, 8 out of 10. So the 5KX basically copies the exact layout of the SKX, but with the added benefit of slightly raised embossed indices all the way around and an applied Seiko logo under the index at 12, which I do think is rather pretty. There's even a bit of automatic script a la the SARB 033 above the index at 6. Again, no date frame, it's all pretty basic. The hands are flat rather than beveled, but it's a little prettier than the SKX, so it gets a 9 out of 10. Now the Orient is not a bad looking watch. It features applied indices, nice little red tip to that second hand, and they do slap a silver frame around the day-date complication. But it doesn't necessarily make the watch look richer or more expensive. High polished surrounds to those indices and a slightly cumbersome frame I think make the watch a little bit cheaper looking than it might have done. Orient logo is embossed, everything else is just printed on there. I suppose it's something that you get used to, but it is a bit more over-designed than the Seikos, dropping a point, 7 out of 10. HEIMDALLR are shameless. They copy the case from the SKX and they copy the dial and hand layout from the Marine Master. Applied indices though, double baton at 12, singles at 6 and 9, circles everywhere else. Nice handset, I must say, a little bit more texture than any of the other watches. Nice horizontal brush and that classic signature paddle with a flash of red on the second hand. Again, no date frame around the date complication at 3, but it's functional, it's legible. It gets an 8 out of 10. It would get a 9, but I'm not a big fan of the embossed silver shark under the index at 12. I think it looks a bit cheap. Moving on to discuss the bracelets. You do not get the earth for $200. There are some obvious price saving exercises, some compromises here and there, mineral crystal, aluminium inserts, etc. One area where manufacturers generally save a few dollars is the bracelet. Not too bad across the range here. The standout though is the Sharkey with their Jubilee, 9 out of 10. I'm going to give the Orient and the SRPD 6 out of 10. Controversially, I'm going to award the Seiko SKX with an 8 out of 10. The Jubilee, people either love it or hate it. I'm a bit of a lover, so it gets an 8 from me. Yes, it's jingly jangly, it's rattly, the end links are hollow, the clasp is fairly rubbish, but it is incredibly comfortable in operation. So much flex here, it looks like it's a 20-year-old watch rather than a brand new watch, but when you have it on your wrist, super comfortable. They're also pretty good to size because small links, plenty of adjustment on the clasp there. You should not have difficulties getting the SKX to fit you like a glove. 8 out of 10. The bracelet on the SRPD is alright. Hollow end links, and again it's got the fairly nasty cheap looking, cheap feeling press clasp. Reasonable amount of micro adjust though, but the links are masquerading as a 3-link oyster, but really these are single solid links with push pins. I wish there was a bit more taper though. 22 down to 20, back up to 22 at the clasp. It feels maybe slightly over braceleted, unlike the SKX, which has that big taper down to 16 and back up to 18. I think a better match for the watch. Still not too bad, fairly comfortable for everyday use, 6 out of 10. And everything I said about the SRPD bracelet applies to the Orient bracelet. Single links masquerading as 3-link oyster, hollow end links, nasty press clasp, but it's alright. One point to note is the clasp is really, really long. No problems getting it on and off though, but it does feel a bit bulky under your wrist, 6 out of 10. But it is the cheapest watch of the day that has the best bracelet, that being the Sharkey. I spent the extra $10 and opted for the Jubilee. If you're vaguely inclined towards Jubilees, then I would suggest you do the same. Solid end links, basic clasp, but it is a proper milled clasp, should last you a fair amount of time. Not as many micro adjusts, and they're shorter, but then so are these links, just push pins, but it's a nice 5-link tube. Not as much taper as is featured on the SKX. It goes from 22 down to just under 20, but it's nice and comfortable. Not as much flex either, but it feels pretty solid, 9 out of 10. On to the Lume. I loves me some Lume, so it was inevitable with 4 dive style watches that I would do a Lume comparison, and I'll pop the video up in just a second. Bit of a shock here, I ran the test twice just to confirm. The SKX, the weakest of the day today with a 7 out of 10. 8s for the SRPD and the Sharkey, but the Orient gets a strong 9 out of 10. Indeed, I featured the Orient in Lume Wars episode 3, and it won Lume Wars episode 3, beating some much more expensive watches into the process. Quite remarkable for a $200 diver. You're not going to be disappointed by any of these. I was a bit surprised that the SKX faded first. Lume bright on the 2 Seikos, not quite sure what the Orient and the Sharkey are using, but they didn't do too badly for themselves. The Kamasu here though, the clear winner, thanks to those nice and legible hands. As we head towards the end of the comparison, 3 double-weighted categories, I appreciate there's a little bit more subjectivity in these 3 than some of the others, but nonetheless I'll explain myself. If you're going to have this watch as your daily, then I think brand is quite important. It's nice to look down and see a prominent, well-known, well-respected brand on your wrist, and you really don't get much better for $200 than Seiko. Hence the 2 Seikos get 8s doubled to 16. Orient not quite got the same cachet, not quite got the same level of recognition, though they do make some great watches and they've got a fantastic fan base, 7 out of 10. The Sharkey, HEIMDALLR, is it a HEIMDALLR, is it a Sharkey? Regardless, it's a Chinese knockoff brand, 4 out of 10 doubled to an 8. Now, if you don't care about brand at all, then you can scratch this category entirely and rejig the scores as you see fit, but I do think it is important for a daily. But there's not much that matters more for a daily than comfort, and I think the SKX takes the prize here. Really strong score, 9 out of 10. As I said, I love the Jubilee. I appreciate not everybody's into it, but the Jubilee combined with all those soft curves and edges on the case make for a really unobtrusive, very comfortable long-term daily wear watch. Very strong, 9 out of 10. The SRPD and the Orient wear quite similarly. They're pretty comfortable, 7 out of 10 double to 14. I do think maybe those bracelets could do with a touch more taper on them, a bit more flex, they'd be a bit more comfort, a bit more elegance there if they had. Now the Sharkey, in spite of the fact that it's got the best bracelet here, only gets a 12. The sharp edges from those crown guards really have damaged the Sharkey here today. It lost 2 points for the case. It loses at least 2 more, doubled to 4 points, because if you wear this watch loose, those sharp edges are going to dig into the back of your hand. If you're an above the knuckle, nice and tight guy, like I tend to be sometimes, it's not going to be as much of a factor, but Jubilees, I think they're great bracelets for wearing loose, and if you wear this one loose, it's going to dig, and that's not great, so it only gets a 6 out of 10. And last but not least, it's our final double weighted category. I'm going to work those price tags back into the rating. Value. SKX, the most expensive watch here, it's got the most basic movement and it's got Hardlex crystal. It gets a 6 doubled to a 12. The SRPD, I think it's not bad as a value proposition. It's a little bit cheaper. It's got the hacking and hand winding movement. It's a pretty watch to look at. No real weaknesses. 7 out of 10. I think the Orient, it's the sapphire crystal that gets it the very strong 8 today. It maybe doesn't quite have the brand cachet of the Seikos, but no real weaknesses. $200, $210, I think that's a very good price for a watch with sapphire crystal by a big brand, and you can get these in red, green or blue as well, don't forget. 8 out of 10 doubled to 16. But the clear value winner today is the Sharkey. That's a pretty good set of specs for $150. Remember, factory direct from China. You're not paying shareholders like you are with these ones. 9 out of 10 doubled to an 18. So where does that leave us then? Well, it leaves us with 4 watches getting 4 pretty good and pretty similar scores. I don't think you'd regret picking up any of these as your daily, apart from the Sharkey if it did indeed dig into the back of your hand. I'm a bit upset with the Sharkey for doing that. Clearly the value proposition, great specs for the money, but I can't hand on heart recommend it because I would be worried that you would find it uncomfortable as I have. So it gets the worst score of the day, equal today, 101.72%. The SKX, even though it's discontinued, even though it's outclassed, even though it's outdated, $250, I still think it makes a fairly strong case for itself, especially when it comes to the comfort and all-day wearability if you like the Jubilee bracelet. The SRPD, not quite the quantum leap over the SKX that we had been anticipating, perhaps a missed opportunity there to do some of the other upgrades, the sapphire crystal, etc, etc, and why don't they give us a Jubilee option on that one? I know there's a mesh, but it's not quite the same thing. It does enough though to beat the SKX for value. The updated movement, the pretty looks and the price tag do get it across the line a nose ahead of the SKX with 74%, but the overall winner today with 76% is the Orient Kamasu. I think the Orient, if you're okay with the slightly chintzy looks, is a great choice as a daily. Maybe a bit more left of centre than the Seikos, not quite the default choice, but I think you're going to see these on a lot of the wrists that would otherwise have been wearing SKXs had they not been discontinued. The standard bracelet is probably the weak point on the Kamasu, but strap could do a replacement if and when you feel the need to spend another $80 on it in a couple of years' time. So the SKX, perhaps not quite dead, but certainly dying. No shortage of rivals though, looking for that crown, but today the crown goes to the Kamasu. Thanks for watching, I will see you in the next video.